Hello and welcome to the Beef Edge, the Teagasc Beef Podcast, for all your latest news, information and advice for Irish beef farmers. I'm Catherine Egan, and with rising costs of fertiliser, farmers are questioning if clover has a role to play on beef farms and is it an option on their farm. On this week's episode, I'm joined by Teagasc researcher Deirdre Hennessy to discuss top tips for sowing and managing clover. Deirdre, you're very welcome. Does clover have a role on beef farms?
Clover definitely has a role on beef farms. Indeed, it has a role on all ruminant production systems that are based in grassland. The main advantage of having clover in your sward for the beef farmer is that it fixes nitrogen from the atmosphere, and basically you have a free source of nitrogen into your sward. And the other main advantage of having clover in your sward is that it offers a high quality feed. And when clover starts to increase in the sward from May, June onwards, that's often when we see a dip in grass quality. And as a result, you can see a slowing in live weight gain for beef animals. But we know that when you have clover in the sward, the feed quality, so the quality of the herbage, that's the grass and the clover mix, that the cow or the growing animal is eating, remains higher. So the milk production for the suckler cow will be of high quality and good yield, and the live weight gain for the beef animal will continue on an increasing plane without taking that dip that we can see sometimes in the June-July period.
So there's multiple benefits for having clover in the sward, Deirdre. How does clover actually work?
It has a good relationship with bacteria that exist in the soil called rhizobia bacteria. And how that relationship works is that the bacteria infect the hairs on the roots of the clover plant and they form nodules. So basically, if you dug up a clover plant, Catherine, and you looked at the roots, you'd see these little, almost like little balls or little lumps attached to the root of the plant. And inside those nodules, there is the rhizobia bacteria. The clover plant, supplies that bacteria with energy. So basically, as the plant grows, it's photosynthesizing. So that means it's capturing energy from light, and that's converting it into energy for growth in the form of sugars and so on. And it makes that available for the rhizobia bacteria. And then the bacteria have enough energy to fix nitrogen from the atmosphere. So basically, they're trapping the nitrogen and converting it into a form that can be used by the plant. So initially then the clover plant will use that nitrogen for growth, but over time there'll be enough nitrogen circulating in the soil from clover that's breaking down in the soil that you will see a benefit in terms of grass production. So the nitrogen that is fixed by the clover is used for clover growth and for grass growth.
And how much nitrogen can the clover fix?
So it depends, Catherine, on various factors, but we'd be quite comfortable in saying that in a well-managed sward, you can fix anywhere between 100 and 150 kilos of nitrogen per hectare. It's very much influenced by the amount of clover in the sward. So you ideally have, on average across the year, somewhere around 20-25% white clover. So, that's going from a low in January, February of around maybe 5% to a peak in end of August, start of September of maybe 40-45%. It's also influenced by how much chemical fertiliser nitrogen is being applied. So if you think back to what I was saying about the fixation process, it does take some energy, quite an amount of energy really, for the bacteria to fix that nitrogen. So if it has it freely available in the soil from fertiliser, it will use that. And so the amount that it's actually fixing will be reduced. And the other thing is, the clover plant does need energy for growth. So if you have good grazing management across your swards, so you're not leaving the covers get too heavy before the cattle go in to graze them, and you're cleaning them out to around 4 centimeters, you're getting plenty of light down to that clover plant for that photosynthesis, from which the clover plant delivers the energy to the rhizobia to fix that nitrogen. So there's lots of factors, Catherine, that influence it. Sunlight is another one, obviously for photosynthesis, but if the weather is very, very dull, there's going to be less sunlight. And if it's very cold, the bacteria isn't as active either. So there's lots of factors that affect it. Some we can't really control, but there's a lot that we can. So like ensuring we've good clover persistence and good grassland management are key things that the farmer can do to ensure that he's capitalizing on that, that the main benefit of having clover in his sward, that is nitrogen fixation.
So I suppose, Deirdre, maybe at the start, before even establishing white clover, what advice have you for farmers?
Yeah, so I suppose, have a think about, do you want to put the clover in? Where are you thinking of putting it in? So, one of the things any farmer should do is identify where they want to put the clover on their farm. And there are a lot of things to look out for. So if you're considering over-sowing, you need good soil fertility, low weed burden, and a nice open sward. So probably a sward that was recently reseeded. If you're doing a full reseed, again, you need to know, what soil fertility you have. You need to fix your soil fertility or correct your soil fertility if it's not adequate. And again, make sure you get a good kill off and have, a nice seed bed for putting in that clover. Then, you need to select the clover type that you're going to put in. So for cattle graze swards, we would recommend a medium leaved cultivar of white clover. And then, make sure you can put in the right sowing rate. The other thing that's really important, when thinking about putting in clover into your sward is to be thinking about your grazing management, to ensure that you get good persistence of that clover once it's established. So, have you a paddock system in place? Can you graze off the swards in 2 to 3 days once you put the cattle into that paddock? Are you on top of your grazing management? Are you comfortable with grazing management? You might need to think a little bit about the infrastructure. Have you the paddock system, roadways, and so on? I suppose they're the main kind of things, Catherine, to be thinking about in terms of planning on getting clover into the swards.
And you mentioned there the seed rates, Deirdre. What's the best time to oversow clover, and what seed rates should it be sown at?
Yeah. So really, Catherine, the best time to oversow, is around April and early May. Going later reduces the chances of success with clover in terms of getting a good establishment and also getting enough grazings on that clover for the rest of the year to help with its establishment going into the following winter. So regardless of whether you're oversowing or reseeding, aim to do it as early as you can in the year. So April time, if at all possible. In terms of sowing rates, so as I said, you'd want to select a medium leaved cultivar of white clover for cattle graze swards. And in terms of reseeding, somewhere around 3.5 to 5 kilos per hectare of medium leaf clover seed. So up to 2 kilos per acre. And then for oversowing, somewhere between 4 and 6 kilos of white clover seed per hectare. So somewhere around 2.5 kilos per acre in terms of oversowing.
And can you talk through how you would go about oversowing clover?
First is the selection of your paddocks. As I said a while ago, make sure your soil fertility is good on those paddocks and that there isn't a heavy weed burden on them. If either of those two things, either soil fertility or weeds, are an issue, fix them this year, address those issues this year, and then next April, 12 months, be ready to go in with your clover seed. And when you're spraying off weeds, just be aware that there is a residue time for a lot of the sprays that can be up to 4 months. So just check that. Basically what that means is if you were to go out now and spray your paddocks, you wouldn't be in a position to oversow them until July or so, and at that stage really to get a good establishment it's too late. So take your soil samples this year, deal with your weeds this year, and address your soil fertility. So you want index 3 or 4 for P and K, and you want your soil pH over 6.2. Okay, so then select your clover seed, and you can find out what clover seeds are available on the Department of Agriculture Recommended list, it's available on their website, but generally the medium-leaved cultivars that are available are Chieftain, Buddy, Iona, Crusader, and Aberhurled. They're the cultivars on the medium on the recommended list as a medium leaf size. Then in terms of going into your paddock, so as I said, the best time to go is around April, start of May. Graze off the paddock as tight as possible. So really skin out that paddock so that there is no big amount of grass material on the paddock that you're going into. You could also, if you were taking a cut of bales early in May, you could go in after the cut of bales. Then you can either broadcast the seed or you can stitch it in. Now we have seen from some of Michael Egan's on-farm clover work that stitching in is much better than over-sowing, than broadcasting. So with broadcasting, I mean using a fertiliser spinner. So definitely for over-sowing, if you can stitch the clover in, that would be the best. And then stitch in at the rate that's recommended. So somewhere between 4 and 6 kilos of white clover seed. Oversow directly after grazing or that tight cut silage. The advantage of stitching in is that you get good seed to soil contact, which is really important for germination. And clover seed, if you've ever handled a clover seed, it's tiny. It's like a full stop on a page. So, to get that contact with the soil is really important for that plant to germinate. It only has a small amount of energy available in the seed, so it really needs contact with the soil on germination so that it can start to send out a root system and it can establish.
What fertiliser program would be recommended for after oversowing the clover?
So we would be advising to possibly skip that fertiliser round for the round that you're putting out the seed, and after that around half rate of fertiliser would be ideal, Catherine. So if you are putting out a bag, you can go with a half a bag, or if you're putting out half a bag of urea, protected urea, go with a quarter bag of protected urea. So about half rate for maybe 3 rotations. But while the fertilizer nitrogen is important, the post-sowing management is absolutely critical, because if you do not have good post-sowing management, your chances of ending up with a well-established white clover sward are very limited. So what I mean by post-sowing management, and this is for either a full reseed or for an oversown sward, is that you should go out and graze the sward as soon as the new plants are strong enough. So you're probably looking at going into the sward when there's maybe 900,000 kilos of dry matter per hectare on it, so quite a low herbage mass, and graze it out tight to around 4 centimeters. So, with a reseed, you might even go out a bit lower. You might be down around 600 kilos even. Graze it out and come back again then frequently. So you might be coming back every 14, 15 days. You really shouldn't be leaving your cover on those paddocks go over about 1,100 kilos of dry matter per hectare for certainly the next 3 rotations. So very, very low covers, Catherine, on those swards. They do need a little bit of management to get that good establishment. Excuse me. Ideally, don't close them for first cut silage or for bales at all in that first year after oversowing or reseeding. And if at all possible, close them a little bit later in the last rotation, just so that you're not carrying a very heavy cover on them into the winter. And I suppose on that note, because you have to manage the area that you're after oversowing, I suppose don't be overly ambitious in the amount of area that you're going to be able to oversow in 1 year, because if you're to manage all the area adequately, you should probably be looking at maybe 20-25% of the area oversowed in a given year, and maybe another 5-10% reseeded.
I suppose that's key. The fact the covers are going to be grazed at 8 or 10 centimeters and grazed down to 4 centimeters on each grazing. I suppose a concern a lot of farmers would have, Deirdre, would be maybe the risk of bloat. How could that be avoided?
There is, I suppose, some risk of bloat. A lot of farmers would be concerned about bloat. But look, I think bloat can be managed. It's not so in Moore Park, I appreciate it's dairy cows and not beef cattle, but we've had very, very limited occurrence of bloat on the study here over the last 9 years. But I suppose key things that the farmer can do in terms of managing or reducing the risk of bloat is, firstly, to avoid switching between grass only and grass clover swards as far as possible. I know that's not 100% possible, but so if a farmer decides to oversow a percentage of the farm, Catherine, maybe he could assign a certain group of animals to that area of the farm. Remember, in the first few rotations after oversowing, your clover content's going to be low anyway, because it's only establishing. But, you know, if you could keep the same group of animals on those paddocks, that would probably help. But the other things are, if you can't, and that's not always possible, is don't have excessively low post-grazing sward heights. By that I mean, don't be grazing the paddocks out really, really tight, particularly when clover content starts to increase. So you don't need to be grazing below 4 centimetres. Then the other thing is, if cattle are going into a risky paddock, you could give them a smaller allocation at first so that they're forced to eat the grass and the clover. Or you could give them a bit of hay or straw, you know, under the fence. That just would get some extra fibre into the rumen. You can also use like bloat oil in the drinking water. That can help reduce the incidence of bloat. And of course, you know, if you are worried, just keep an eye on the cattle for the first about 3 hours after they're turned into a clover paddock. So the risk of bloat, I suppose, increases when you have a high clover content in the sward. The cattle are quite hungry going into the paddock, and it's wet, and the weather is wet, because clover is a low dry matter, and if you have a lot of water there because the weather is wet, that even brings the dry matter of what they're consuming down. But bloat is very manageable, Catherine, and you know, bloat shouldn't be the reason that farmers are put off putting clover into their swards. Just once they're aware that they may need, you know, to keep an eye on cattle, or, you know, when they go out first, and make sure they're not really hungry going into a clover paddock.
That's great, Deirdre. And where can farmers get more information?
Teagasc website, there is information on. We will have clover. We'll have a clover stand at the Grange open day this year. There are a number of clover walks taking place in April, Catherine. They'll be advertised on the Teagasc website and on Teagasc social media. And the Grass 10 team are also putting together a clover booklet. So it's the management and establishment of grass white clover swards. And I think that's going to be sent out to all Teagasc clients in April. So there's loads of information available, Catherine, and even if anybody's listening, you know, they can always contact an advisory office or so on to get that booklet. And again, as I said, the website, there's a lot of information on the Teagasc website around clover.
That's great, Deirdre. Thanks very much. Some great tips and advice.
Thanks, Catherine.
That's all for this week's episode, and my thanks to Deirdre for joining me on the show. You can catch up on all other shows and interviews from the Beef Edge podcast on the Teagasc website at teagasc.ie, or you can listen on Apple and Google Podcasts as well as Spotify. Don't forget to rate, review and subscribe so you never miss a show. For all other updates from our beef programme, keep an eye on our Twitter and Facebook pages. Until next time, I'm Catherine Egan, and thanks for listening.